The ocean was endless, an ever-shifting tapestry of deep blues and silvers beneath the full moon. The waves moved like restless spirits, whispering secrets no mortal could hear. Amid the vast, unforgiving sea, a lone figure drifted. Seraphis. She had once been the pearl of the abyssal kingdom, a mermaid of rare beauty, her iridescent scales shifting between twilight blue and shimmering violet. Her hair, dark as the ocean's deepest trench, floated around her like ribbons of ink. But now she was nothing, a forsaken daughter of the sea, abandoned to die in the void between worlds. The cold bit into her skin as she floated, barely conscious. The salt burned in her lungs. Above, the stars flickered like distant embers, their light too far to offer warmth. Her own kind had cast her out. Seraphis, the cursed one, they had called her. She will bring ruin to the tides. She had pleaded, her voice lost in the crashing waves. But their judgment was final. The abyssal guard had dragged her past the borders of their kingdom, beyond the reach of light, and left her to the mercy of the abyss. Now, there was only silence. A shadow loomed beneath her, a beast of the deep, its serpentine form coiling in the darkness. It had been circling for hours, waiting for her strength to fail. She could not fight. She could not run. A wave swelled and then. A gunshot. The water around her exploded into a blur of bubbles. The sea beast recoiled, slithering back into the abyss with a guttural hiss. Through her fading vision, Seraphis caught sight of something impossible. A ship. Its massive black sails billowed against the wind, tattered at the edges but strong as iron. The hull was carved with the sigil of a crimson tide, its figurehead a winged serpent with glowing sapphire eyes. A pirate vessel. Men leaned over the railing, their torches flickering like fireflies against the night. Their voices were rough, urgent. Then, a splash. A man had leaped into the water. Seraphis wanted to move, to escape, but her body refused to obey. Darkness curled at the edges of her vision. Rough hands reached for her, pulling her from the water's embrace. She felt warmth. Strong arms wrapped around her, holding her close as she was lifted into the night air. The world spun. Her body hit wooden planks, the scent of salt and iron thick in the air. Torches flickered around her, casting long shadows over scared, weathered faces. Rough voices murmured, some filled with awe, others with fear. A mermaid. She's still breathing. She'll curse the ship, toss her back. A boot stomped on the deck, silencing the crew's whispers. A man stepped forward, his long coat sweeping behind him like a cloak of midnight. His presence was commanding, his eyes sharp as a dagger's edge, storm gray like the sky before a tempest. Salt and wind had carved his face into something rugged but striking, a man who had seen battle and survived. Captain Dorian Vane. His gaze swept over Seraphis, studying her, not with fear, but with something else. Curiosity. Defiance. She tried to speak, but her voice was nothing more than a whisper lost to the wind. Dorian knelt beside her, one hand braced against the deck. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice deep as the tide. He reached out, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. Her skin was cold. Her breath was weak. "Captain," one of the crew warned. "She's not human." Dorian ignored them. His fingers found the faint pulse at her throat. She was alive. Barely. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Something dangerous. Then he stood. "She stays," he said, his voice cutting through the night like steel. The crew erupted into shouts, but Dorian's glare silenced them. His orders were law, and no man aboard the Crimson Tide dared challenge him. Seraphis barely heard any of it. Her world was slipping away, lost to exhaustion. As the night wrapped around her like a velvet tide, she felt it, warmth, for the first time since she had been cast out. A single thought lingered before darkness claimed her. The sea had abandoned her, but a pirate had saved her. Seraphis awoke to the scent of salt and wood. The world swayed beneath her, the distant crash of waves filling the silence. She wasn't in the sea. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was curved, made of dark, aged wood. Lantern light flickered, casting golden shadows along the walls. The room smelled of damp rope, rum, and something rich: parchment, ink, adventure. Then she felt it. Rough fabric against her skin. Heavy blankets, too warm. Her body, bare legs where her shimmering tail should have been. Panic struck like a dagger to the chest. She bolted upright, gasping, her fingers pressing into the foreign sensation of knees, calves, human skin. She had legs. Her breath came fast, heart pounding. This wasn't possible. It was a cruel curse, a trick of the land. She clutched the blanket, pulling it tight against her. A voice cut through the chaos. "You're awake." She turned sharply. A man stood near the cabin's desk, his figure tall and shadowed in the dim light. His long coat hung open, revealing a loose white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark trousers fitted with a worn leather belt. A cutlass hung at his hip, a pistol strapped beneath his coat. His face, rugged, carved by the wind and waves. His jawline sharp, his lips firm. His storm-gray eyes watched her, unreadable. Captain Dorian Vane. Seraphis said nothing, only pulled the blankets tighter. She felt exposed, small. She was not meant to be like this. Dorian leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "You've been unconscious for 2 days." 2 days. Her throat was dry, her mind foggy. She swallowed, voice barely a whisper. "Where am I?" "My ship." The crimson tide. His voice was deep, steady. "I pulled you out of the water. You were half dead." She closed her eyes, memories rushing back. The cold sea, the monster circling, the gunshot. His arms pulling her from the abyss. "You saved me." "I don't make a habit of saving drowning girls," he said, "especially ones with tails." She tensed. He stepped closer, pulling a chair beside the bed. "It's gone, by the way. Your tail." Her hands trembled. "I know." Dorian studied her for a moment. "That normal for your kind?" "No." Her voice wavered. "Mermaids do not change." He exhaled, running a hand through his dark, wind-tussled hair. "Well, I don't know how it happened, but you're stuck with them now." He nodded toward her legs. "Stuck." Seraphis curled her knees to her chest. She had already been cast out of the ocean. But this was something crueler. The sea had not only abandoned her, it had turned her into something she didn't recognize. Dorian must have seen the despair in her eyes, because his voice softened just slightly. "What happened to you?" Seraphis hesitated. She did not know him. He was human, a pirate, a man who belonged to the world that had warred with her kind for centuries, and yet he had saved her. She looked into his eyes, searching for cruelty, for mockery. She found none. "They cast me out," she whispered. "My people. They said I was cursed." Dorian didn't move. He simply listened, his expression unreadable. "I don't know why," she continued. "I did nothing wrong. But they left me to die." A flicker of something crossed his face. Understanding, perhaps. "The sea's a cruel mistress," he murmured. "She gives, she takes." Seraphis glanced at his hands, scarred, calloused, the hands of a man who had fought for everything he had. "And what did she take from you?" she asked. His jaw tightened. He looked away. "More than I care to remember." Silence settled between them. Outside, the ship groaned against the waves, the distant voices of the crew carried on the wind. Finally, Dorian stood. "You need rest. Drink this." He grabbed a pewter cup from the desk and placed it on the small table beside the bed. "It'll help." Seraphis didn't reach for it. "Why did you save me?" Dorian met her gaze. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a ghost of a smirk, he answered, "I don't know." And with that, he turned and stepped out of the cabin, leaving her alone with the sound of the waves. Seraphis exhaled, staring at the door long after he was gone. She had been abandoned by the sea, But perhaps, just perhaps, she had found salvation in a pirate. The night air was thick with salt, the sea stretching like black glass beneath the stars. The crimson tide sliced through the waves, her sails billowing against the wind. The crew moved like shadows across the deck, voices low, wary of the strange presence among them. Below, in the dim lantern glow of the captain's quarters, Seraphis sat curled in the bed, knees drawn to her chest. The fabric of the borrowed shirt and trousers felt unnatural against her skin, too rough, too dry. Her fingers traced the curves of her legs, foreign, weak, nothing like the sleek power of her lost tail. She didn't belong here. Not in this body. Not in this world. The door creaked open. Dorian stepped inside, his coat draped over one arm, the scent of the sea clinging to him. He paused, his sharp gray eyes taking her in. The way she shrank against the headboard, lost in the too large world of his ship. "You should be sleeping," he said, setting his coat on the chair. Seraphis didn't look at him. "I can't." Dorian exhaled, running a hand through his wind-tousled hair. I know the feeling." He crossed the room, pulled a bottle from the shelf, and poured a dark liquid into a pewter cup. "What is that?" she asked. "Something to calm the nerves." He took a sip, then smirked. "Not sure if mermaids can hold their liquor, though." Seraphis frowned. "I am not a mermaid anymore." The words tasted bitter. Dorian's smirk faded. After a pause, he sat in the chair beside the desk, the flickering lantern light casting shadows across his face. "Tell me," he said, "what do merfolk whisper about pirates?" She glanced at him, wary. "That you are liars. Thieves. Killers." Dorian huffed a quiet laugh. "They're not wrong." Seraphis frowned. "Then why save me?" Dorian leaned back, stretching his legs. "Maybe I wanted to prove your kind wrong." Seraphis searched his expression, but there was something guarded in his gaze, something he wasn't saying. Before she could press him, a knock echoed against the cabin door. "Captain." The voice belonged to Boone, Dorian's first mate. Dorian pushed to his feet. "What is it?" Boone hesitated. "We have a problem." Dorian's expression darkened. Without a word, he strode past Seraphis and swung the door open. She hesitated, then slipped off the bed and followed him out onto the deck. The air was different now, thick with tension. The crew stood in clusters, hands gripping weapons, eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea stretched empty before them, no land in sight, no sails in the distance. And yet, something was watching. Seraphis felt it. A shift in the tide, a presence beneath the waves. A predator's gaze locked onto them from the abyss. Then she heard it. A deep, resonant hum, low and guttural, vibrating through the ship's wooden hull. A warning. Seraphis went rigid. She knew that sound. "The abyssal guard," she whispered. Dorian turned sharply toward her. "Who?" She swallowed hard, dread coiling in her chest. "My people's elite warriors." Her fingers dug into the railing. "They've come for me." A moment of silence. Then, a shape broke the surface. The ocean roared. A sudden wave crashed against the crimson tide, rocking the ship violently. The crew staggered, hands gripping ropes and railings as salt water sprayed over the deck. The abyssal guard moved as one, their sleek bodies vanishing beneath the surface like ghosts of the deep. Seraphis clutched the railing, heart pounding. She knew what was coming. "They won't fight like men," she warned. "They fight like the sea itself." Dorian unsheathed his cutlass, its steel glinting under the moon. "Then we fight like devils." The moment he spoke, the first attack struck. A harpoon, glistening with barnacle-covered steel, shot from the depths and embedded into the mast with a sickening thunk. A second one followed, piercing through the sails. Then, without warning, the water exploded. A warrior lunged onto the deck, his spear aimed for Dorian's chest. The pirate captain barely dodged, spinning as he slashed. Steel met steel in a clash of sparks. More warriors surged upward, landing with eerie silence despite the battle's fury. Seraphis stumbled back as one of them turned toward her. His helmet was adorned with coral, his black eyes cold and merciless. "Princess," he growled, "you will return." Fear gripped her, but before he could strike, a gunshot rang out. The warrior reeled back, a smoking hole in his shoulder. Dorian stood between them, pistol raised, his expression sharp as a blade. "She's not going anywhere." The warrior hissed, retreating as more pirates rushed forward, cutlasses flashing in the lantern light. The deck became a storm of steel and salt. Swords clashed. Gunfire cracked. The scent of gunpowder mixed with the briny air. Boone, the first mate, fought like a wild beast, a dagger in each hand, cutting down any who came too close. Jareth, the ship's sharpshooter, stood atop the quarterdeck, reloading his musket with deadly precision. Seraphis pressed against the mast, her heart racing. She had no weapon, no way to fight, but she knew the power of the ocean. Closing her eyes, she reached for it. Nothing. The connection was gone. She was no longer part of the sea's endless current. A curse, a punishment. The despair threatened to consume her, until she heard Dorian's voice, raw and fierce. "Move." She barely had time to react before he grabbed her hand, pulling her away just as a warrior's spear struck the wood where she had stood. Dorian's grip was strong, his touch warm despite the cold battle around them. He pulled her behind him, shielding her with his own body as he blocked another strike. Seraphis had never known a human like him. Pirates were meant to be selfish, ruthless. Yet here he was, standing against the tide for her. Her fingers tightened around his coat. "We can't win this," she whispered. Dorian's smirk was sharp. "You underestimate pirates." Then, with a sharp whistle, he called out, "Fire!" A thunderous explosion ripped through the night. Cannons. The ship rocked as fiery blasts tore through the water, forcing the abyssal guard to retreat. Some warriors dove back into the depths, others staggered, their armor cracked from the force of the blast. Varian stood on the waves, untouched. His silver hair flowed in the wind, his expression unreadable. "This is not over," he called. "The sea does not forget." With that, he turned and vanished beneath the surface, the remaining warriors following. Silence fell. The pirates stood panting, weapons still raised, eyes scanning the dark waters. But no more attacks came. The battle was over, at least for now. Dorian exhaled, rolling his shoulder. Well, that was a hell of a welcome party. Seraphis stared at the ocean, still feeling Varian's presence like a phantom in the depths. "They'll come again," she said. "They won't stop." Dorian wiped blood from his lip, then turned to her. "Neither will we." For the first time since she had been cast out, Seraphis felt something strange. Hope. The pirate had chosen to stand beside her. And now, their fates were tied, whether to victory or to ruin. The scent of gunpowder lingered in the salty air. The deck of the Crimson Tide was slick with seawater, the sails torn from the battle. Pirates moved about, securing ropes, checking the damage, and tending to the wounded. The ocean was calm now, but the memory of the abyssal guard lingered like a ghost in the waves. Seraphis stood near the railing, staring at the dark water. The sea that had once embraced her now hunted her. She could almost hear Varian's voice in the depths, whispering of the storm yet to come. She was not safe, but she was not alone. Behind her, Dorian approached, rolling his shoulder as if shaking off the weight of battle. His shirt was torn, a fresh cut along his forearm, yet he carried himself with that same unshaken confidence. "You're quiet," he said, stopping beside her. Seraphis hesitated. "They will return." "Aye," Dorian agreed, watching the water. "They will." She turned to him, her voice low. "You don't understand, pirate. The abyssal guard do not lose. They will chase me to the world's end." Dorian smirked. "Good thing I've never cared much for the world's end." Seraphis frowned, confused. "What?" He leaned against the railing, looking at her fully now. The wind tousled his dark hair, his storm-gray eyes sharp yet unreadable. "You're afraid they'll take you," he said, "that you're running out of time." She nodded slowly. Dorian tilted his head, thoughtful. "Then let's outrun them." She blinked. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his smirk widening. "They may be fast, but they don't know the waters like I do. No one can catch the crimson tide if I don't want them to." Seraphis searched his face, looking for a trick, a hidden motive. But Dorian Vane was a man impossible to read. "You would risk your life for a mermaid?" she asked, voice softer now. Dorian's smirk faded, replaced by something quieter, something almost serious. "You're not just a mermaid," he said. "You're my mermaid now." The words sent a strange warmth through her. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair before glancing back at her. "Besides, I like a good fight. Keeps life interesting." Seraphis couldn't help but stare at him. Dorian Vane was reckless, unpredictable. He had no reason to help her, no treasure, no profit to be gained. And yet, he had drawn his sword against warriors of the deep, standing between her and the wrath of the ocean itself. Something about that unsettled her. Something about that made her heart race. Before she could speak, Boone's voice rang out from the helm. "Captain, ship spotted." Dorian turned sharply. Jareth, the sharpshooter, had his spyglass raised toward the horizon. "One ship about a league out," he called. "No colors." Dorian's brow furrowed. Could be trouble. Seraphis followed him as he strode up the steps to the quarterdeck. The night was dark, but in the distance, faint lantern lights flickered against the water. The ship was moving toward them, slow and deliberate. "Who are they?" she asked. Dorian didn't answer right away. He took the spyglass from Jareth, peering through. Then he stiffened. Seraphis noticed the subtle shift in his stance, the way his fingers curled tighter around the spyglass, the way his jaw clenched. She stepped closer. "Dorian." He lowered the spyglass, exhaling sharply. "Damn it all." Boone frowned. "Captain." Dorian's voice was laced with something rare, something close to dread. "It's the Black Horizon." The name sent a ripple through the crew. Seraphis saw it in their faces, the way the blood drained from Boone's, the way Jareth stiffened. Even the most hardened men looked uneasy. "Who are they?" she asked again. Dorian's eyes were dark as the sea before a storm. "Pirates," he said grimly, "but not the kind you want to cross." A chill settled over Seraphis. The abyssal guard hunted her beneath the waves, but now another danger loomed on the horizon, one born not of the sea, but of men. And for the first time, she wondered if even Dorian Vane could outrun them all. The ocean lay still, yet the crimson tide felt as if it were caught in the jaws of something unseen. The crew whispered nervously, gripping their weapons, their eyes fixed on the approaching ship. Lanterns flickered across its blackened hull, revealing a monstrous silhouette against the moonlit waves. The Black Horizon, a name spoken in fear across every port, every tavern. A ship of ghosts, some said, a ship of men who had long forgotten mercy. Seraphis felt it, a different kind of danger. The abyssal guard hunted her with purpose, a duty written in the laws of the sea. But this ship, these men, hunted only for the thrill of taking. Dorian stood at the helm, his expression unreadable, though his grip on the wheel was tight. Too tight. "You know them," Seraphis said, stepping beside him. Dorian let out a slow breath. "Aye." She waited. He didn't look at her, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the ship that closed in. But she saw it, the flicker of a memory in his gaze. "Who are they?" she asked. Dorian's voice was quiet. "A past I thought I left behind." The Black Horizon drew closer, until its dark sails loomed over the water like the wings of a vulture. A single cannon fired, not at the ship, but into the air. A signal, a warning. Then came the voice. Deep, smooth, laced with amusement. "Dorian Vane," it called. "Still breathing, I see." Dorian's jaw tightened. A shadow moved at the bow of the enemy ship. Captain Rickson Vale stepped into the lantern light. He was tall, his coat lined with silver embroidery, his boots polished like a nobleman's, an insult to the rugged life of a true pirate. His dark hair was tied back, and his sharp blue eyes gleamed with knowing mischief. Seraphis recognized him instantly. A predator. Not one that killed with steel alone, but with words, with patience. Dorian's voice was even, but she felt the tension beneath it. "Vale." Rickson spread his arms. "No, Captain Vale. No proper greeting for an old friend." Dorian's hand hovered near his pistol. "You're no friend of mine." Rickson laughed. "Ah, that wounds me." He stepped forward, his boots clicking against the deck. "I heard whispers of a mermaid aboard your ship. Thought I'd see for myself." Seraphis stiffened. Dorian took a step forward, placing himself between her and the man on the other ship. "You heard wrong." Rickson tilted his head, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Did I?" He let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Come now, Dorian. I know you. You wouldn't risk your life, your ship, your crew, for nothing." His smirk sharpened. "So tell me, is she worth dying for?" The crew bristled. Boone tightened his grip on his cutlass. Jareth muttered a curse under his breath. Dorian didn't flinch. "She's mine," he said. The word sent a shiver through Seraphis. Rickson raised an eyebrow. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. "Then I'll make you an offer," he said smoothly. "Hand her over, and I'll let you sail away. No blood, no fire, just a clean deal." Dorian's smirk was razor sharp. "You always were bad at reading people, Vale." Rickson sighed, shaking his head. "A shame." Then, in a voice like silk-wrapped steel, he said, "Sink them." The air shattered. A cannon roared from the black horizon, and the crimson tide rocked violently as the first shot tore into her side. The crew leaped into action, scrambling to man the cannons. Seraphis stumbled, catching herself against the mast as Dorian bellowed orders. "Boone, return fire." A blast erupted from their own ship, shaking the deck. Smoke curled into the night as wood splintered from the impact. Seraphis turned toward the water, toward the abyss waiting below. She could almost feel Varian's presence still lingering in the deep. The abyssal guard would return soon, drawn by the chaos. Two enemies, one above, one below. Dorian's voice snapped her back to reality. "Seraphis." She turned to him. His eyes locked onto hers, fierce and unwavering. "I need you to trust me." Her breath caught. The ship trembled, fire and shadow clashing upon the waves. And in that moment, Seraphis knew, no matter how this battle ended, she would never be the same again. The night exploded into war. The crimson tide lurched as another cannonball tore through its hull, sending shattered wood flying through the air. Smoke curled into the sky, mixing with the scent of salt and gunpowder. The sea was alive with chaos. Flames reflected on the water's surface as pirates from both ships clashed steel against steel. Dorian moved like a storm, his cutlass flashing in the firelight as he cut through an enemy who had swung aboard. He fought without hesitation, his every movement precise, controlled. Boone was at his side, a dagger in each hand, snarling like a wild beast as he took down two men in quick succession. Seraphis pressed herself against the mast, her heart pounding. She had no weapon, no power to fight. She could only watch as Dorian battled to protect his ship, his crew, her. Then she saw him. Rickson Vale, the captain of the Black Horizon, stepped calmly across his ship's deck, as if this were nothing more than a game. His long coat billowed behind him, his blue eyes gleaming with amusement as he observed the battle. Then his gaze found Seraphis, and he smiled. A cold shiver ran through her. Before she could move, before she could even cry out, a rope shot across the gap between the ships. A hooked blade lashed onto the railing beside her, And then, a man swung through the smoke. Seraphis gasped as rough hands grabbed her. Dorian. She struggled, kicking, twisting, but the pirate who had taken hold of her was strong. He yanked her off her feet, dragging her toward the edge of the ship. The sea loomed below, dark and endless. Dorian turned at the sound of her voice. His eyes widened, then darkened with fury. Let her go. His voice was deadly calm, but the promise of violence was thick beneath it. The pirate holding Seraphis hesitated, but before he could react, Dorian was already moving. He crossed the deck in a flash, shoving past bodies, ignoring the clash of steel around him. He didn't stop, didn't think. Then, bang! A gunshot rang through the night. Seraphis flinched, but the pirate holding her jerked back, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He collapsed, and she stumbled forward, only to be caught by strong arms. Dorian. His grip was firm, his body solid against hers as he steadied her. His heart pounded beneath his shirt, his breath quick. You all right? His voice was raw, barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, her fingers clutching his coat. A shadow moved behind him. Dorian. Before she could think, she grabbed his arm and yanked him aside. A sword slashed through the air where he had just stood. Rixen Vale. The pirate captain smiled as he lowered his blade. Quick little mermaid, he mused. I can see why you like her, Dorian. Dorian turned, positioning himself between Seraphis and Rixen. His cutlass was steady in his grip, his expression cold. This ends now, Dorian growled. Rixen chuckled. Oh, I agree. Then, with unnatural speed, he struck. Steel met steel. Sparks flew as their swords clashed, each strike faster than the last. Dorian fought hard, his movements sharp and relentless. But Rixen was toying with him, his smirk never fading, his footwork effortless. Seraphis could only watch, helpless. Then Rixen spoke. You've changed, Dorian. He parried a blow with ease, stepping to the side. The old you would have sold her to me without a second thought. Dorian's jaw clenched. That man is dead. Rixen laughed. A shame. He was profitable. Then, in a sudden blur of motion, he knocked Dorian's sword aside and drove his fist into the pirate captain's stomach. Dorian gasped, staggering back. Dorian. Seraphis tried to run to him, but Rixen's men grabbed her arms, pulling her away. Dorian forced himself to stand, his breathing ragged. Let her go. Rixen wiped his blade against his coat. I think not. Then he nodded to his crew. Take her. Seraphis screamed as she was pulled toward the black horizon, her heart pounding wildly. She fought, kicked, twisted, but the hands dragging her were too strong. Dorian. Dorian surged forward, only to be struck from behind. Boone shouted his name, but the world tilted as Dorian collapsed to the deck, darkness clawing at his vision. The last thing he saw was Seraphis disappearing into the shadows. Then everything went black. Pain burned through Dorian's skull as he stirred, the world around him spinning. His vision blurred, the scent of salt, blood, and smoke thick in the air. Someone was shaking him. Captain. Captain. Boone's voice. Urgent, desperate. Dorian forced his eyes open. The deck of the Crimson Tide was in ruins. Fire flickered along the railings, broken planks, and fallen bodies scattered across the ship. The black horizon was already disappearing into the fog, its dark sails vanishing beyond the waves. And Seraphis, gone. Dorian lurched forward, shoving Boone aside as he stumbled to the edge of the ship. His grip tightened on the splintered railing as he watched the enemy ship grow smaller, taking her with them. Taking his mermaid. Boone's voice cut through the chaos. Captain, we have to go after them. Dorian didn't answer. His mind was a storm, rage and desperation clashing inside him like two opposing tides. They had her. Rixen had her, and if Dorian didn't get to her soon, He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. Boone tried again. Dorian. Dorian turned, his storm-gray eyes fierce. Get the ship ready. We follow them. Boone hesitated, then nodded, barking orders to the crew. Dorian didn't wait. He grabbed a rope and swung across the deck, landing near the helm. His hands tightened around the wheel. Every muscle in his body burned, his wounds forgotten. He had fought storms, sea beasts, and men who called themselves kings. He would not lose her. Seriphus clutched the cold iron bars of her cage, her breath shallow. The dim lanterns of Rixon's cabin cast eerie shadows across the room, their flickering light dancing over maps, golden trinkets, and stolen treasures. But she was not a trophy. She was not something to be owned. The ship rocked, and she could hear the distant laughter of the crew. They thought they had won. They were wrong. The door creaked open. Rixon stepped inside, his blue eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. He took a slow step toward the cage, tilting his head. "You know," he said, his voice smooth as the sea before a storm, "I expected more fear." Seriphus met his gaze, her own steady. "I do not fear men like you." Rixon chuckled. Brave words. He knelt beside the cage, running his fingers along the bars. "But bravery won't change your fate. Dorian won't come for you." She said nothing, because she knew he would. Rixon's smirk faded slightly, as if he could sense her certainty. A knock on the door interrupted him. A pirate peered inside, his face uneasy. "Captain, the crimson tide is coming." Rixon stilled. Seriphus's heart leaped. Then the ship trembled. A cannon's roar split the air, shaking the walls. He came. Dorian came. Dorian stood at the bow of his ship, the wind whipping through his dark hair, his coat billowing like the wings of a vengeful storm. "Fuel sail," he roared. "Bring us to her." The black horizon turned sharply, its cannons firing. But Dorian didn't slow. He moved through the battle like a man possessed, cutting down anyone who stood between him and her. Seriphus pressed against the bars, her heart racing. Then the door burst open. "Hold on," he said, reaching for her. She did. His arms wrapped around her, lifting her from the cage. She clung to him as he carried her through the chaos, his body shielding hers from every danger. The sea raged. Fire and steel clashed, but none of it mattered. He had her, and he wasn't letting go. As they reached the deck, Rixon stood waiting. His blade was drawn. His smile was gone. Dorian set Seriphus down gently, then turned to face his old enemy. "No more deals, Vel." Rixon sighed. Pity. Then they clashed. Their swords struck like lightning, each blow filled with years of hatred, of history. The deck became their battleground. The crew stepping back, watching as the two captains fought for far more than victory. Dorian was relentless. His every strike was fueled by something deeper than rage, something stronger. And for the first time, Rixon faltered. A single misstep, a single opening. Dorian took it. His cutlass slashed across Rixon's chest. The pirate captain stumbled back, blood soaking his coat. His eyes widened, then darkened. Dorian pointed his blade at him. "Your reign ends here." Rixon chuckled weakly. "Perhaps." Then, with one last smirk, he let himself fall, disappearing into the sea below. The black horizon fell silent. The battle was over. Dorian turned to Seriphus. She was already moving toward him, her eyes shining with relief. He caught her in his arms, holding her against him. She buried her face in his chest. "You came for me." His arms tightened around her. Always. The wind howled. The ocean stretched before them. And as the crimson tide sailed toward the horizon, the pirate and the mermaid stood together, unshaken. For no force in the world, neither men, nor gods, nor the sea itself, would ever tear them apart again.